Hey there, Psych 370 students, and welcome to your second video lecture for week 5. In my previous video lecture, I talked about stimulus substitution theory, which was originally proposed by Pavlov. And toward the end of that video, I told you about one big problem with stimulus substitution theory, which is that the conditioned response is not always the same as, or even similar to, the unconditioned response. In other words, animals don't always respond to the CS in the same way as they respond to the US. And so that's a big problem for stimulus substitution theory, because if the CS really does become a substitute for the US, then animals should respond to both of those stimuli in the same way. And again, they don't always do that. However, in this video lecture, I'm going to talk about another theory of classical conditioning called preparatory response theory. And differences between the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are not as problematic for this theory as they are for stimulus substitution theory. So guys, the reason this theory is called preparatory response theory is because it basically suggests that all conditioned responses are preparatory responses. In other words, according to this theory, the conditioned response is what you do to prepare yourself for the unconditioned stimulus. So the idea here is that we learn to predict the occurrence of the unconditioned stimulus based on the occurrence of the conditioned stimulus. So we learn to treat the CS not as a substitute for the US, but rather as a signal that the US is on the way. Again, the CS allows us to predict and prepare for the US. That's the idea. So, preparatory response theory is consistent with something that we learned about last week, which is that the different temporal relationships between the CS and the US are not equally effective as far as getting the person or the animal to acquire a conditioned response. So, if you'll recall, last week, in one of last week's video lectures, I talked about how the more effective procedures in classical conditioning are the ones where the CS occurs before the US, like it does in trace conditioning and in delay conditioning. And again, trace conditioning and delay conditioning tend to be quite effective. We typically see acquisition readily taking place when those temporal relationships are used. So trace conditioning and delay conditioning are quite effective procedures for getting a person or an animal to acquire a conditioned response. In the other less effective procedures, the CS does not occur before the US does. It either occurs at the same time as the US does, as in the case of simultaneous conditioning, or the CS actually occurs after the US, which is how backward conditioning works. But again, those procedures tend not to work very well. And guys, the ineffectiveness of simultaneous conditioning and backward conditioning is something that preparatory response theory clearly predicts. Because after all, the only way that the conditioned response can prepare you for the unconditioned stimulus is if you perform it before the unconditioned stimulus arrives. And for that to happen, the conditioned stimulus has to occur before the unconditioned stimulus does. And so it makes sense in terms of preparatory response theory that we'd see classical conditioning happening here, where the CS can act as a signal that the US is on the way, but not here, where the CS can't act as a signal like that because the thing that it would signal, the US, has already happened. And obviously, that's not how signals work, right? I mean, you don't make the turn when you're driving and then put on your turn signal, right? I hope you don't do that. Signals obviously have to come before the things that they signal. So, if preparatory response theory is right, and the CS is basically a signal that the US is upcoming, then that CS is only useful if it happens before the US does. And so it makes sense that you'd only acquire a conditioned response to that CS if it happens first, because that's the only way that that conditioned response could be a preparatory response. That is the only way that that conditioned response could prepare you for the unconditioned stimulus. So anyway, preparatory response theory gets some support from the fact that classical conditioning works best when the CS occurs before the US does, and not very well at all when the CS doesn't occur before the US does. Preparatory response theory has a good explanation for why that would be the case, and so that's definitely a strength of this theory. Another strength of it is that not only can it explain cases where the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are similar, it can also explain cases where they're different. So remember, according to this theory, the conditioned response is a preparatory response. It's what you do to prepare yourself for an unconditioned stimulus that you've learned to predict. So you acquire this conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus because you've learned that the conditioned stimulus is a signal. It signals that the unconditioned stimulus is on the way. So now you have this preparatory conditioned response that sort of gets you ready for that US. And sometimes the way you get ready for something, the way you'd prepare yourself for something, is the same, or at least similar, to how you'd react to it when it actually occurs. For example, Pavlov found with his dogs that their conditioned response to the sound of the metronome was the same as their unconditioned response to the food, right? In both cases, the dogs would salivate. But preparatory response theory can explain why the conditioned response here is salivation, because that definitely helps prepare the dog for the food, right? It helps prepare the dog for that unconditioned stimulus. I mean, it lubricates the dog's mouth and throat so that the food is easier to eat, and so it can slide down the dog's gullet. Saliva also has enzymes in it that aid in digestion. So, look, the dog does salivate when it eats. Salivation is its unconditioned response to food. That's how it reacts to food. But it also prepares for food by salivating. So, salivation is also a response that prepares it for that unconditioned stimulus. And so that's why the conditioned response in this case is the same as the unconditioned response. Or another example where the CR and the UR are similar like that is the air puff example that I described in my previous video lecture for this week. So in that case, your conditioned response to the tone and your unconditioned response to the air puff would both involve blinking. So why do you blink in response to the tone? Stimulus substitution theory would say it's because the tone has become a substitute for the air puff. But preparatory response theory would say, no, the tone warns you that you're about to get the air puff. So again, the CS, the tone, is a signal for the US, the air puff. And so you blink in response to the tone because that prepares you for the air puff. It helps prevent the air puff from striking your naked eyeballs, including your very sensitive corneas at the front of your eyeballs. And so blinking also makes sense here as a conditioned preparatory response because it reduces how aversive that air puff is. It reduces how unpleasant that unconditioned stimulus is. So again, according to preparatory response theory, all conditioned responses are preparatory responses. And sometimes the way you'd prepare for the US is the same as or similar to how you'd react to the actual occurrence of the US. And so that's why the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are sometimes similar. But again, preparatory response theory can also explain cases where the CR and the UR are different from each other, which is definitely an advantage that it has over stimulus substitution theory. For example, if you present a rat with an electric shock to its feet, if you briefly electrify the floor of the rat's cage, then that rat will jump. So foot shock is an unconditioned stimulus that elicits jumping as an unconditioned response. The rat doesn't have to learn to react like that to the foot shock, right? It does that naturally, it does that reflexively. So in this example, foot shock is the US and jumping is the UR. But if you pair a neutral stimulus, like a bell, with those foot shocks, so if you go bell shock, bell shock, bell shock over and over again, if you pair those stimuli, then the conditioned response that the rat will acquire to the bell is not jumping, it's freezing. So when the rat gets the US, when it gets the shock, then it jumps. But when it gets the CS, when it hears the bell, it freezes. It stops moving, it crouches down, and it tenses up its muscles. So in this case, the CR and the UR are different, right? The UR is jumping, that's how the animal reacts to the shock, but the CR is freezing. That's how the animal reacts to the bell. So why are those two responses different? Well, according to preparatory response theory, the animal freezes like that when it hears the bell because, again, it knows now that the shock is coming soon. It's learned to predict the shock. It's learned that the bell is a signal that the shock is on the way. And so it's all tensed up like that because it's getting ready for the shock. It's anticipating the shock. And it's actually a good idea for the rat to have that kind of posture in anticipation of the shock, because that way it can minimize how long it actually experiences the shock by being ready to jump off of that electrified floor as soon as the shock occurs. So, again, we can understand that conditioned response, that freezing response in this case, as a preparatory response. It prepares the animal for the unconditioned stimulus. Now, of course, another way to interpret that rat's behavior is to consider the way that it naturally responds in dangerous situations in real life. And your book talks about this a little bit, and it's pretty interesting. So I want to finish this video lecture with it. So, guys, the most common analog to electric shock that a rat would naturally encounter in the wild would probably be an attack by a predator, right? It's not going to get shocked, probably, in its natural habitat, but it could get attacked by a predator, like, say, a snake. Now, if a rat actually does get attacked by a snake, then jumping would be a good idea because that could help the rat escape from the snake. So, jumping is a pretty smart way for the rat to react to a snake attack when a snake attack actually does occur. But if the rat just hears a snake hiss, or if it sees a snake off in the distance, if it detects one of those warning signals that a snake attack might be imminent, then jumping would not be a good idea. Jumping would not be a smart way for the rat to respond to those stimuli that it only associates with snake attacks. Because after all, it's always possible that the rat detected the snake before the snake detected the rat. And so if the rat jumps when it just hears a snake hiss or whatever, then it could wind up revealing its position, right? And giving itself away. So in other words, jumping could actually make this rat more likely to get attacked. And so, of course, it's not going to do that. That's not a good way for the rat to respond to these stimuli, these conditioned stimuli like the hissing that it associates with snake attacks. Instead, it's better off responding to those stimuli by freezing. It's better off staying still, being quiet, minimizing its chances of being found, but also being ready to flee at a moment's notice. Okay? So the point is, again, the way an animal reacts to the unconditioned stimulus when it actually occurs is sometimes quite different from how it prepares itself for the occurrence of that unconditioned stimulus. And according to preparatory response theory, that's why the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are not always the same. They can be the same or similar, but they don't have to be. The important thing is that the conditioned response gets you ready for, it prepares you for the unconditioned stimulus. So again, guys, the big idea behind preparatory response theory is that the conditioned response is a preparatory response. It's what you do in preparation for the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so preparatory response theory makes a lot of sense, and it can explain many examples of classical conditioning, including ones where the CR differs from the UR. But of course, having said that, preparatory response theory isn't perfect either. Auto shaping, in particular, is difficult for it to explain, and I talk about that a little bit in my next video lecture, which is about a sort of variation on preparatory response theory that's called compensatory response theory. So I'd encourage you to check that video out too when you can. But that's going to do it for this one. So please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day. Take care, guys.